It's October, the stereotypical season for haunted houses. And I've been getting a lot of comments like, I can't wait to see what you have up for us this spooky season. What? You mean like separate from what we normally do here? I'm afraid I've set that bar a little too high for myself lately. But you know what? It has been a while since we covered a good old haunted house story here. A lot of the times, I try to steer clear of them, especially the more common and mundane ones. The ever-present Lady in White type story that no one is ever quite sure of who it actually is. Or the haunted mansions that have ghosts because a Civil War battle took place on the property, or something like that. I'm not trying to take anything away from these locations, though. It's just that since we like to look at the history behind the hauntings, it would make for a really short video just saying, yeah, there's ghosts here because a bunch of people died there over time. But today's story is something a little different. A good documented past behind it, a potential link to MK Ultra, and newspaper headlines that try to accuse a ghost itself of murder. How could I pass up on this one? Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. In March of 1981, newlywed couple Gary and Esperanza Belofsky moved into their new home at 6304 Beryl Road in Alexandria, Virginia. They were just shy of their one-year wedding anniversary and were already viewing the new home as their forever home, regardless of the fact that it was outside of their price range. But to help make up the difference, the couple took on a roommate, a friend of Gary's named Bruce. It was a spacious 3-bedroom home, though, plenty big enough for the Belofskys, Bruce, and any kids that they may produce in the future. Their first weeks in Alexandria were as near to perfect as they could ask for. With the help of their friend Bruce, 25-year-old Esperanza, or Epi as she was affectionately called, and 29-year-old Gary spent the first couple of weeks unpacking, decorating their new home, and ultimately just getting used to their new home. Everything was near perfect. The only negative things they could remotely point to was the occasional dish falling off the kitchen counter, or a glass being found broken in the sink. A simple bout of clumsiness after a night of too much wine, perhaps. It was easy enough to explain away. Initially, anyway. Of course, there was the occasional dark shadow and strange creaks in the house. But that was normal when adjusting to a new home, right? Never mind the fact that Epi suddenly found herself having trouble sleeping. The inside joke became that they were sharing their new home with a ghost. It was a playful joke between Gary and Epi. But Bruce grew aggravated with it. He was a natural skeptic, which was only fuel to the fire for Gary and Epi. They kept the joke going, so Bruce started staying quiet with his rebuttals, in the hopes that they'd eventually grow tired of their playful jabs and move on to something else. Toward the end of their first month there, Bruce was out doing some yard work when a neighbor came over to introduce themselves. In the conversations, the neighbor asked, "You do know the history about this place, right?" Of course, Bruce did not, and the neighbor seemed more than willing to offer up what he knew. Bruce was told how the previous owner had died in the home 8 years earlier by suicide, hanging herself in the basement just before Halloween. Of course she did, Bruce thought, especially with the Halloween timeline. That was way too cliché for him to fall for, so he immediately thought that Gary and Eppie must have gotten to the neighbor first and recruited him into their ongoing joke. He decided to keep the encounter quiet. It was a battle of wills at this point. But as time progressed, it started to become obvious to Bruce that there may have been something else going on other than their simple game. Either that, or Gary and Eppie's approach to it made no sense. The unexplained breaking of dishes continued, now even in the presence of them in the kitchen, but more often now around the Belofskys than Bruce. And things progressed to strange sounds from the walls and smells from the kitchen sink, one they described as a mix of smoke and rotten flesh. Rather than keeping up the suspected ruse of a haunting, though, Gary suspected a possible plumbing issue, and the sounds from the walls could maybe be rats or even raccoons trying to get into the garbage cans outside. And as for the continuous breaking dishes, Gary and Eppie offered up no explanation. As Bruce had wagered, the more he ignored things, the more Gary and Eppie pulled back on their talks of ghosts. But not for the reasons Bruce had initially thought. Eppie had grown more and more worried about the possibility herself, fueled with the beliefs and superstitions from her immigrant family and the stories she remembered hearing as a child. Her sleep continued to be disturbed, and she had started having strange and disturbing dreams. Even when she couldn't remember them, she still woke up with a feeling of dread. Then, one morning in early May, Eppie woke up before Gary and made her way to the kitchen to get coffee started. But the smell of coffee was already there. Eppie continued on, thinking that Bruce must already be awake, but she was shocked to find a pretty middle-aged woman sitting at the kitchen table, cradling a coffee mug in her hands. Against her better judgment, Eppie's mind immediately went to the thought of a ghost sitting directly in front of her, but when she jumped and blinked her eyes, the woman was still there, sitting and smiling. She even greeted her by name, saying, "Hi, Eppie." Eppie returned the greeting, although obviously confused, but she now thought that Bruce must have had someone stay over the night before. But as she entered the kitchen, the woman continued, "You may think your life is perfect, but when you're at work, I'm here alone with your husband." This enraged Eppie, who immediately demanded to know who this woman was, but she stopped short when the walls behind the woman grew dark, and the shadow spreading out towards her. It was then that Eppie was jolted awake, finding herself sitting straight up in bed in their dark bedroom. It took her a while, but she was eventually able to convince herself that it had all been a dream. Dream or not, though, that event was a tipping point for Eppie. Talks of ghosts were no longer an inside joke around the home, and as far as any ghosts were concerned, it was game on. The strangeness around the Belofskys' home ramped up to include heavy banging and unexplained footsteps that kept them up at night. The sound of breaking dishes became more frequent, nearly every week now, and the smell of smoke from the kitchen sink intensified to the point of setting off the smoke alarms, even though no physical smoke could ever be found. There was even one instance where Eppie found that her car outside had been moved, now blocking the driveway, even though both Gary and Bruce denied any involvement. By this time, Bruce was growing concerned. He tried his best to remain skeptical, but there was just too much now that he just couldn't explain. He still stayed quiet about his conversation with the neighbor he had months earlier, but now Bruce took it upon himself to do a little fact-checking to see what all he could find out for sure. And find out he did. 8 years earlier, in October of 1973, there in fact had been a death in the house. A woman named Mary Conlon. Bruce was able to find that the Conlons moved into the home in the spring of 1973. 39-year-old Raymond fell in love with the house almost immediately, but for 46-year-old Mary, not so much. Much like Gary Belofsky, Raymond Conlon saw the spare bedrooms filled with children one day. Mary kept her concerns quiet, but in her mind, she knew that would never happen. At 46 years old, she had resigned herself to the idea of being infertile. If it hadn't happened by now, that must be the case. It was said that she would wake up super early in the mornings, make coffee, and sit alone in the kitchen, drowning in the silence of the house, viewing the empty rooms as the house mocking her. It was obvious to those that knew her that Mary was suffering from depression. This led to all sorts of irrational fears and worries. She worried that Raymond regretted marrying someone so much older than himself, someone that couldn't give him the life he wanted. Of course, there were never any reports that substantiated any of those thoughts, but depression can hit us hard and heavy sometimes. She worried that the people in their church looked at them differently. Being a Catholic family with no children of their own, Mary knew that they must be judging them, probably thinking they never wanted children, resorted to methods of birth control that the church frowned upon. Again, none of these worries were ever found out to be true, but again, depression can be rough on someone. Over time, Mary got it in her head that Raymond was cheating on her. She had no proof of it. She didn't even have anything that she could point to as to why she had those feelings, but she did, and she couldn't shake them. They eventually consumed her mind, and she even convinced herself that those around her knew it too, and judged her for living with an adulterer. One particular morning, on October 28th, 1973, 3 days before Halloween, Mary was in the middle of her normal morning ritual of self-loathing and despair when she heard her husband Raymond stirring in the bedroom. Mary herself was not bothered by the coolness of the fall mornings, but she knew that Raymond preferred the house to be a little on the warmer side, so she always waited for Raymond to wake up before turning up the heat in the mornings. And this morning was no different. She went into the basement to adjust the furnace settings, bumping the settings up to where Raymond preferred, which sent an acrid smell of smoke up from the sudden increase of the temperature of the heating elements. This, too, was normal for the morning routine. The only thing that was different on this particular morning was the length of rope that Mary had concealed in the basement. Secured to a rafter overhead and a noose on the other end, Mary climbed atop the furnace, took one glance at the creaking floorboards above her as Raymond entered the kitchen for his morning coffee, then stepped off the edge of the furnace. Raymond found her lifeless body shortly afterwards. Bruce finally came clean to Gary and Eppie of the conversation with his neighbor and everything that he had found afterwards. And even before the pictures were discovered of Mary Conlon, Eppie immediately knew that this was the woman from her dreams. Eppie took it upon herself to learn everything she could about Mary. In her mind, that's what Mary wanted, since she had revealed herself directly to Epi in her dreams. Epi talked to neighbors and tracked down the first responders of the day 8 years earlier. Eventually, Epi learned that Mary had tried taking her own life in a failed attempt weeks before as well. Gary got freaked out about the findings, but not as much as Bruce, who was no longer a skeptic, to say the least. But for Epi, there wasn't that much fear. Epi felt more sympathy than anything else for the spirit of Mary. Epi took note that there hadn't been any efforts to hurt any of them. To Epi, it was more like Mary just wanted to be noticed and recognized. So she encouraged both Bruce and Gary to be accepting of their new situation and to learn to live with the spirit. Epi even addressed the spirit of Mary directly, telling her she could continue staying there, but that their only request was that she stop breaking things. And well, that seemed to work. There were still little things that happened around the house, but there were no more broken dishes happening in the kitchen. What continued was little things, events the housemates viewed as simple pranks afterwards. Ultimately, Epi and Gary got used to things and viewed the spirit as just another roommate in their home. That summer, in June of 1981, the Belofskys reached out to the American Institute of Parapsychology about the events in the past of their home, and Dr. James McLennan took the opportunity to take on the case and to try to learn more. Dr. McLennan made several visits to the home over the course of the next few months, befriending the Belofskys and turning into a regular at their home, although he never got to witness any of the spirit's activities for himself. It would seem to the Belofskys that perhaps Mary didn't like the idea of Dr. McLennan being there, since, after his first visit there, dishes in the sink broke immediately after he left. This was the first instance of something being broken in the kitchen in weeks. But to Dr. McLennan, though, he had a different theory. In his work, it was common for couples that were having any issues in their relationship to frame any uneasiness and such to a haunting instead. But even though this was something Dr. McLennan found to be somewhat common, he did report that he found no issues or tensions that would suggest to him that the Belofskys were anything than a normal, happy couple. Gary and Epi continued reporting paranormal activity to Dr. McLennan, but said it was only about 1 or 2 events per month at this point. Despite the doctor's theories, though, Epi and Gary were 100% on board with the idea of a haunting, so they were all in with Dr. McLennan's next suggestion. He wanted to conduct a seance there. It was scheduled as soon as the doctor was available, and they ended up holding the seance a couple of weeks later in July. They had even convinced Bruce to attend, against his better judgment. Bruce had fallen back into his natural skepticism as the paranormal events seemed to wind down, but Dr. McLennan insisted, since he lived there, the spirit of Mary would know him. The group of 4 gathered around the kitchen table, none of them really sure what to expect. Dr. McLennan explained that if Mary was there, then it was something with the house that was keeping her there, perhaps as easy as the surroundings constantly reminding her of her emotional state, thus preventing her from moving on. He had the group focus on the thought of Mary, the image of her body in the basement, then, after a few minutes, directed them to imagine a soft, soothing light growing from the table they surrounded, thinking of this as a doorway that the spirit of Mary could pass through. The spirit never showed itself, never made anything move or break, but in the weeks after the seance, the Belofskys reported that paranormal events dramatically decreased. Gary and Eppie convinced themselves that even though it seemed that Mary did not move on, she was maybe now at peace with herself. To them, there was no other explanation of the fall and the strange events around the house. Bruce had another idea, though. Perhaps it had never been a spirit at all. Maybe everything was just dumb bad luck, and he had fallen into the idea at Eppie and Gary's constant urgings of the idea of a haunting, especially early on. By August, Bruce had gathered his things and moved out of the home, leaving the Belofskys to whatever ideas they wanted to keep about their home. The couple understood, but it was still a financial impact on them, so they were forced to take in another roommate. That fall, a woman named Cindy moved in, and unlike Bruce, Cindy fully believed in ghosts. By that time, the spirit of Mary was a lot less active, but still there. Gary and Eppie were open and honest with the fact that their home was haunted, but spared Cindy the story as to why. But it wasn't long before Cindy started experiencing Mary. She would wake up at night to find an image of a woman in her bedroom window. When she described the image to Gary and Eppie, Eppie could only laugh in enjoyment. Even though she had never described what Mary looked like in her own dreams of Mary in the kitchen, Cindy described the image of Mary perfectly. For Gary and Eppie, this was confirmation that they had been right all along. For Cindy, though, it was just too unnerving, and she moved out not much later. Eppie and Gary weren't bothered by this. They had fully embraced the idea of Mary living there, and were even public about it, giving interviews the day before Halloween to a local paper that was covering haunted locations in the area. In short time, the Belofskys took on 2 more roommates, Joe Baddens and Evans Davies. They were not bothered with the idea of the place being haunted. In fact, it was the stories that urged the two to try to move in, just to see what they could witness for themselves. That seemed to have the opposite effect, though, as with more people in the house, the less and less active Mary seemed to become. In fact, when Dr. McLennan followed up with them in April of the next year, the Belofskys said that there had been nothing happening at all outside of a few broken glasses in the sink here and there, and maybe the smoke alarm falsely going off, maybe once or twice. The thought now was that Mary had finally found her peace, and life simply moved on as normal. Time moved on, and once again they found themselves in summer. By then, there had been no strange events at all. Life normalized for those living in the house, and in June, talks began between Gary and Eppie about the idea of having children. Both seemed excited at the idea, but later that night, Eppie ended up falling down the stairs. She wasn't seriously hurt, but to her, it was a sign. She said she felt like the rug had been snatched out from under her, and that was what caused her fall. She was then reminded by the idea that Mary had been unable to have children of her own, and Eppie found herself wondering if this had been Mary, lashing out in anger. A couple of weeks later, the couple went out for dinner, leaving Joe and Evan at home alone. They had turned in for the night, but were alerted to a loud crashing sound from the kitchen. Joe described the sound as a loud bullhorn, while Evan said that it sounded like a bull in a tin can factory. They cowered together upstairs, waiting for the Belofskys to return home. They had heard the stories of Mary, but had not witnessed anything themselves yet, so they were not sure if they should be worried or if this was something of Mary's normal activity. But when Eppie and Gary got home, nothing was found out of place, and they just laughed it off. A week after that, Eppie experienced the bathroom door creaking open while she was in the shower. She reached across the small bathroom and pushed the door closed, but again, it opened. She stuck her head out the door, but there was no one anywhere in the hallway. She shut the door back and got back in the shower, but when it opened a third time, Eppie knew that Mary was back. This time, the feeling was different, though. That was a line that Mary had never crossed before, and now Eppie felt unnerved and vulnerable, like Mary was now out to genuinely scare her, or worse. That same night, Eppie talked everyone into going out for the evening. If for nothing else, Eppie herself needed a distraction from the day's events, and it was well after midnight on June 27th, 1982, when the four of them made their way home after a night of clubbing. They all stumbled to bed for the night, but an hour later, the smoke alarm in the kitchen sounded off. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence, but one that Joe and Evans weren't accustomed to yet. They both got out of bed and went to investigate, only to find the kitchen engulfed in flame. They raced back upstairs, the flames chasing them up the stairs at an alarming speed. They alerted Eppie and Gary to what was going on before escaping from a second-story window. By the time they made it to the ground and a safe distance from the home, the entire house was aflame. Eppie called the fire department immediately, and 2 trucks were dispatched, but it was too little, too late. Joe and Evans watched helplessly from the front yard of the house. They waited and waited, but no one burst from the front door. No one ever climbed down from the master bedroom window. Eppie and Gary Belofsky were pronounced dead on Sunday, June 28, 1982. Eppie's body was found in the master bedroom, asphyxiated from smoke. Gary was found downstairs in the living room, as if he had been trying to make it to the front door. Fire Department Commander Dan Bickham was on hand during the fire, and his blood ran cold when he heard the roommates and neighbors whisper about Mary. He had been one of the first responders back when Mary's body was discovered 9 years earlier. Officially, the fire was declared an accident. Official reports show that the fire started in the kitchen, eerily the same room where all the paranormal events seemed to originate from, the very room that was directly over where Mary had took her own life. The story started gaining attention when the United Press International ran the headline, "Ghost Suspected as Cause of Fire That Killed 2 People." Some call it a freak accident. Some call it mere coincidence. Some say it was Mary herself, and continue to try to speculate as to what Mary's true reasonings were. And you know, we've talked a lot about events such as these leading to alleged hauntings, an emotional imprint on a home or land that lingers and affects things for years and years to come. But if it's an emotional imprint that can do that, does it necessarily have to be death? What other traumas could do something like that? There's at least one researcher that I've come across that looks at this event a little differently. In their own work on the Truly Horror website, they don't view Mary Conlon as a spirit haunting the house on Beryl Road. They view Mary as the house's first victim. A year before Mary took her own life, the home on Beryl Road had another resident, Lieutenant Colonel William Jordan and his wife Virginia. Lieutenant Colonel Jordan's name may be familiar to some of you that run in conspiracy circles, as he was one of the key witnesses in the 1977 MK-Ultra trials. Because of his past and subsequent experiments he underwent in the military, Lieutenant Colonel Jordan suffered from confusion, disorientation, and seizures. He had fallen into the grips of the MK-Ultra experiments 12 years earlier at Fort Benning in Georgia. Back then, no one knew the name of the program, and it was kept super quiet. The premise of it all was to explore the effects of LSD on soldiers, to see if it would be a potential aid in questioning captured enemies, or so the official reports say. Lieutenant Colonel Jordan later testified that it was a, quote, complete personality disintegration. He said that during the experiments, he suffered a loss of self that he would never fully recover. A year after the experiments, he would develop grand mal epilepsy, and although there are no known links between LSD and fertility, his wife Virginia began to experience miscarriages. Lieutenant Colonel Jordan took it upon himself to advocate against the horrors that had been done during the MK-Ultra experiments, and this found him being in Washington, D.C. a lot, so the couple purchased the home on 6304 Beryl Road, the same house that would later be occupied by Mary Conlon, and then later still by the Belofskys. While in the home on Beryl Road, Lieutenant Colonel Jordan said his seizures grew worse. He said it was something about the house itself, describing the shadows as darker than they should be. The seizures escalated to the point where he couldn't control his own thoughts, and hallucinations twisted and blended into whatever darkness was already at the house itself. He swore it was the house itself that was driving him crazy, and in the winter of 1972, they moved out of the house, going south to Florida, just months before Mary and Raymond Conlon moved in. Lieutenant Colonel Jordan got a little better while in Florida, describing those that knew him as living happily until his death in 2013 at the age of 84. Family members admit that the apex of his condition happened while living on Beryl Road back in Virginia. That's where our researchers from Truly Horror come in, and they go back further, 2,700 years to be exact. There was an ancient tablet found in Iraq that shows a horned figure staring out ominously beneath the description of a sickness called Binu, an affliction many doctors today say is epilepsy. The tablet warned of madness falling on the sinful and innocent alike, a madness brought on by the lunar cycle, or sometimes by certain drugs. Once that evil being attached itself to you, you carried it everywhere. Darkness and madness would grow and grow inside you until you eventually died from it. Unless, that is, the demon found some other host it liked better, another person, or sometimes a place itself. This researcher goes on to describe how the Judeo-Christian religions, LSD users, and MK-Ultra theorists all have a common thread: the belief that certain drugs open a door to another dimension, to entities that do nothing but wish us harm. And those entities always jump at the opportunity when we let them in. Their belief is that Lieutenant Colonel Jordan's time spent in the home on Beryl Road turned the property into a magnet for anger and grief, a home that bred isolation, emotions and trauma that some entity needed as a gateway into our own world. It's an interesting idea. But even if you can't subscribe to that line of thought, what about Mary Conlon? Did it all start with her? Was it really her spirit haunting the home? Or maybe you believe that there was no ghost or entity at all. Maybe it was just all coincidence. Even so, that doesn't lessen the impact on the lives of those involved. Fate, a ghostly haunting. A demon trying to enter our world, jump-started by military human experimentation. Whatever the case, it seems like 6304 Beryl Road carries a weight that I don't want to have anything to do with. But I think Dr. McLennan sums it up perfectly for this case. The researchers with Truly Horror was able to track him down and presented their own theory to him, and he replied with this: "I will tell you, you will never know. As long as you live, you will never know."